Companies that know their suppliers, that have validated their operational readiness, have executed and learned from their business continuity plans, are just better prepared companies.
You're listening to the Employee Safety Podcast from Alert Media, a podcast for professionals responsible for the safety and well-being of their employees. Each episode features an interview with a leader in employee safety to discuss how to protect your employees from a wide array of threats, from severe weather to a global pandemic. Let's get into the show.
Hello, and welcome to the Employee Safety Podcast, where we discuss insights and ideas for how to protect your most valuable asset, your people. I'm your host, Peter Steinfeld, and I'm joined today by Rob Glenn, who is the Director of the Office of Business, Industry, and Infrastructure Integration at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, commonly known to most of you as FEMA. Rob, thanks so much for being here. How are you?
Hey, thanks a lot, Peter. Doing great.
Thanks so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. And I know our topic of focus today is how FEMA supports businesses and communities after disasters. But before we begin, could you please provide our listeners with just a brief synopsis of your career background and your role at FEMA too?
Sure. I'll just start in reverse. My role at FEMA is to really support the connection between what the government does and what the private sector is doing. FEMA's mission is to help people before, during, and after disaster. Emergency management is a team sport, and it's my job, along with my team at headquarters, along with private sector liaisons across all 10 FEMA regions, is to really foster those connections before a disaster happens. My background in emergency management, I've got state experience, both in emergency management, running a state emergency operations center, as well as doing some public affairs work. And then also as the Homeland Security Advisor to the Governor and also the Homeland Security Director. Also have some military experience and some consulting time with the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, and FEMA.
Wow, that's fantastic. Excellent experience. Can you just give us an overview of FEMA, as well as the specific services and resources it provides?
Sure. So, FEMA itself started really as an amalgamation of different programs coming out of the Cold War. It was founded in 1979 by President Carter. So FEMA is just a little over 40 years old. Its mission is to help people before, during, and after disasters, like I shared. Just in the last year, we processed over 102 disaster declarations, and we're currently in a 50-state disaster with the global pandemic of COVID-19. We've obligated more than $6 billion towards vaccination efforts over the last year, nearly over 3,600 vaccination sites. And then on the individual aspect of that, more than $1 billion has been provided to disaster survivors just in 2021. We navigated both the 2020, it was historic on multiple levels, just a historic year when it comes to the hurricane activity, but also a historic year when it comes to the pandemic and the global supply chain disruption as well. So, at FEMA, we certainly help people through programs, but when it comes to businesses, we use a variety of different efforts as well. When you apply to receive disaster assistance, you do apply for a small business administration loan. That's good for you, whether you're a business or also an individual. Most of the coordination and most of the support that we provide to businesses is really through ongoing coordination and integration, planning, training, exercises. And that's a function not only of my office, but also making sure that across the FEMA enterprise, we're doing all we can to really align our efforts and capabilities with what the private sector is doing as well.
Until you just said it, I didn't realize FEMA was involved in the COVID-19 response. So how does a disaster get declared at FEMA, and what qualifies as a disaster that you would jump in and help with?
Sure. So as the saying goes, all disasters are local. The states are really key to a disaster declaration. We feel as emergency management professionals that disasters are best managed, locally executed, state managed, and federally supported, and that's either through dollars or capabilities. A local jurisdiction's capabilities really do need to be exhausted for the next level of government to offer some support. Many times we see mutual aid being rendered, not only jurisdiction to jurisdiction, like a township to a township or a county to a county, but it's also within a discipline and also across state lines. And as we work with states, we work in tandem with the states. For example, if a tornado hits a state, a governor will declare a disaster for their state based upon what they have, but also potentially up to the FEMA region for federal disaster declaration that's signed by the president. So this allows different kinds of programs, different kinds of capabilities and resources to be available. We certainly don't want to wait. In a sense, waiting is failure. And certainly we don't want to fail people. We don't want to fail our state partners. Just thinking about, the declaration process and how some of this works, I'm just reflecting a little bit upon Hurricane Ida. Even before landfall, we were looking at that threat almost a week out, working with the states, most significantly Louisiana, but also Mississippi and a few other states more inland, on what the impacts could be. Pre-positioning resources is also something that we can do, not always tied to a specific state declaration. But that declaration from the president does allow us to deploy, allows us to surge, if you will, into position. And that's certainly a lesson learned from some of the events that I mentioned a couple minutes ago. That's all pre-landfall. And then post-landfall, just using Hurricane Ida as an example, and then post-landfall, that's really where a lot of the planning kicks into high gear. Some of those conversations that were started, including with the private sector through the National Business Emergency Operations Center that I lead, and other partner organizations, are already underway. We're looking at what potentially is broken, what needs to be fixed, what community lifelines may need to be stabilized. Thinking about, power, certainly. That was at the forefront of Ida. The government doesn't necessarily have the ability to turn on power, but it can enable those that have that ability to turn on power, to restore communications, to open road networks, and so on. And so that's really what we do, is really, try to serve as the enabler of so many other capabilities through the coordination and communication that we provide. Currently we have more than 1,200 staff in the impacted area for Hurricane Ida, administering programs, helping with the long-term housing mission, particularly in Louisiana. And, recovery is certainly an aspect of emergency management that can go on for decades. And so, for example, even in Louisiana, we still have the office open for Katrina. So those recovery programs last a very long time. And it does require not only just the whole of government to respond to these very significant challenges like COVID-19, but it really takes the whole community and really making sure that we are addressing the needs of the whole community, not just in recovery, but also during a response. And then also as we're preparing for potentially a very bad day.
Yeah, it seems like FEMA really is the grease for the gears that are already there. You guys have the know-how and can call people and bring resources in, and you just know what to do to basically mobilize and activate the local government, the local businesses to help with the overall process.
Yeah, and I think, that's something that it's a good opportunity just to share perspective on that. So, local execution and state managed and federally supported disasters is not just a bumper sticker. Yeah, it's also not just necessarily waiting for the federal government to do everything. It is, as I said, I think earlier, it's really a team sport. You have to have everybody on the field or on the sidelines waiting for a certain mission. And so we also have to think through strategically how different resources are being deployed. There's not an infinite amount of resources at the federal level, certainly at FEMA. We want to make sure that we're responding as robustly as we can, but that's also done in consultation and in partnership with the states. And so that really can't go unsaid, if you will, is that the role of the states to manage their disasters along with the jurisdictions that are in the states. We want to make sure that the capacity is there for a disaster like a flood. Flooding continues to be the number one disaster threat in the United States. We want that to be there so we don't essentially need to respond. I mean, the best response is one where FEMA or other federal assets don't necessarily need to be deployed to, because the capabilities at the state or the other jurisdictions is strong enough, resilient enough, and robust enough to meet those challenges.
Well, what type of assistance can FEMA provide to businesses that are impacted by disasters, and how can an organization go about applying for it?
One of the things that I would just share is that the level of assistance, that financial assistance that FEMA can provide a business is really relatively limited. Where we really can be helpful is enabling businesses to be operational. focusing on business continuity, the operational resilience of systems, so that is the first real responsibility if you're running a business, is to your stakeholders or your shareholders. How do you generate value? That's actually providing that good, that service. And we want companies to be able to do that, large, medium, and small. So we created the National Business Emergency Operations Center in 2012. It was first tested in Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy. And that is a mechanism where we coordinate with businesses of all sizes, typically large businesses, so that we can make sure that we've got open lines of communication. We are integrating different capabilities operationally before a disaster, during a disaster, and then also examining some of the cross-sector aspects of where power, communications, and then also, financial systems, transportation systems, they're all at some point kind of connected. And we work with our partner agency, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, to really manage that. So that is something that we do as I said, it's a team sport. That's one thing that we do. One of the other things that we do is for the employees, this is an employee safety podcast. So individual assistance will not make someone whole after a disaster, but it certainly can help provide some additional resources after there's an application to FEMA if there's a disaster declaration, so that that worker, that associate, that employee can start on the road to recovery. There are also other mechanisms that people can access, whether it's from a non-governmental organization, a faith-based organization, a voluntary organization as well. The Small Business Administration does offer loans to businesses that do qualify. That's some direct monetary potential as well. And then there's also a very significant program that started right before the pandemic, but billions of dollars are being made available for communities to focus on building resilient infrastructure. And so the infrastructure, if it's more resilient to withstand an external strain or shock, it potentially is going to help the entire community. So I would just, in this podcast, there's probably not a lot of time to talk about all the different programs that we have. But if you do go to FEMA.gov, the BRIC program is BRIC. That's the mitigation program. And then in BEOC, National Business Emergency Operations Center, you can see an application there to join that as well.
Fantastic. And so if people are thinking, hey, for my business, I want to get more proactively involved with FEMA, I don't foresee a disaster, I just want to be prepared. Can they visit that same location to get more information? Or is there like a local office they can cover? Is it regional? Like, how does that work? How do they get in touch with somebody?
Yeah, that's a great point. And like I shared a couple of minutes ago, we want to work with our state partners. There are more state coordination mechanisms than existed, even 5 years ago. So if you're a national company, it makes sense to work with FEMA through the National Business Emergency Operations Center, or through one of the 10 FEMA regional offices, where we have a private sector liaison as well. But if you're operating in a state, you have significant operations. Some companies have operations in all 50 states. Sometimes it's easier for them to work with FEMA on an issue. It's a national level issue. But if it's a local disruption, a local disaster, you want to have that relationship with the state, or, if there's another, county, city, if they've got a business emergency operations center, or if they have an emergency support function, or they just have a liaison that can help them navigate whatever the disruption is. There's more people like that now than there ever used to be. And while we sometimes get calls from different size companies, many times we do refer them either back to a region or back to a state, because the state might actually be the entity that is going to be able to solve the problem more locally. And so that's consistent with what I shared earlier, that that local execution of a disaster program, that's where you're going to see, many of those real gritty problems get resolved.
And I guess conversely, do you like to hear from businesses and organizations who say, look, we may not be impacted by the incident that occurred, but we can help. Here's what we do. We make bottled water. We can ship it in. We're a grocery company. We can help with logistics and supplies. Do you like to hear from organizations like that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. We do. And you're seeing more people do that kind of work, but you're also seeing businesses really take more of a corporate citizenship role before, during, and after disaster as well. Some companies get very involved in preparing their employees. Some businesses, there's a program called the Community Emergency Response Team, or CERT. If you go to the FEMA website, there's some detail on that too. Again, that's a federally supported program, but it's locally executed. That really helps build preparedness. And I think that the companies that want to do good should be thinking about how they want to do good before a disaster happens. So, for example, you mentioned bottled water. We purchase bottled water from FEMA. That's one of the commodities that we pre-position and often use to support people that their water systems have been disrupted, or they can't get water because the grocery stores are not able to open during a disaster. At some point, maybe that's a donation from a company to a state. Perhaps a state may want to buy that. FEMA is not always going to be the customer. And so sometimes what we have experienced is that well-intentioned companies want us to buy. We're not in a position to buy. The state may not be in a position to buy. Sometimes there's an alignment that can occur. When you're thinking about a grocery store that just needs to open, that's really good for us to know. And we've got significant relationships with the grocers of our country. And just as a side note, the grocery supply chain, I'm so impressed with the resilience and the work ethic of that industry, given the strain that industry has had throughout COVID, to really make sure that the shelves are stocked, even COVID plus a hurricane, being able to resupply out of their distribution centers. It's just a real marvel that they've been able to do that. And so you created a window for me to talk about grocers, and I wanted to acknowledge that. But there's countless examples like that, not only just for COVID, but also for the tornadoes that occur, hurricanes that occur, the flooding that occurs. They're all federally declared disasters. Most disasters and emergencies never really truly rise to the level of the president's desk. And that's why the capabilities, the capacities are really needed at that state and local level. And that's also where the private sector has a really key opportunity to make a difference too.
Well, FEMA has responded to some of the most devastating disasters in history. What lessons on preparedness and recovery can be learned from all these different crises?
Peter, one of the first things I'll just share is that, both personally and professionally, you're never as prepared as you think you're going to be. That's working from that expectation. You have to strive for preparedness, and you have to strive for being ready for not just the disaster that you think is going to occur, but sometimes it's not just the disaster, it's the disruption caused to infrastructure or to people. And that creates second and third order effects that really need to be contended with. Planning for that is doable. Planning for that does require coordination across the government, federal, state, territorial, and tribal governments. It also requires coordination and integration of business and industry capabilities as well. One other thing that I would just share is that we're all much more aware now, because of COVID and the disruption caused from COVID, of how fragile our supply chains are. We set up our supply chains to be highly efficient and created just-in-time supply chains. And now that we are in a global supply chain disruption due to COVID, that is definitely something that requires some additional attention. Companies that know their suppliers, that have validated their operational readiness, have executed and learned from their business continuity plans, are just better prepared companies. A few years ago, we were actively talking about building a culture of preparedness. Some really large companies, took that to heart and adopted that culture of preparedness at their companies. Those companies that have done so are just more resilient. The communities that adopt that culture are more resilient as well, recognizing that there's always going to be, potentially some sort of nuance in a disaster that, is the proverbial black swan that you just didn't see coming. And that's really hard to kind of contend with. One other thing is that on preparedness is that we have an entire organization at FEMA that deals with preparedness. And they deal with the national level exercise, and that is intended to help the nation be better prepared for disasters. And for those listening that are curious about that, forming that relationship with the local emergency manager, the state emergency manager, it is really paramount to really ensuring that, regardless of the size of your enterprise, you've got the relationship infrastructure that accompanies the actual physical infrastructure of the systems that you're relying upon. And I guess the last thing I would just share is you can always do one more thing, and poking holes in your planning, conducting regular testing and training and exercises. It's really helpful for the C-suite, and it's also really helpful for those that are on the front lines of a company as well.
If it's something you can never really ultimately be prepared for, like there's just no way you can, which you mentioned at the very beginning, then a lot of times that creates paralysis and people don't know where to start, so they just don't start. If you think about creating a culture of preparedness, in your opinion, what is a good way for an organization to just start and jump into it? What's the first thing they should focus on?
There's a lot of different resources on FEMA.gov. We have a whole program that we started a number of years ago, the Ready program. There's Ready Business. There's Ready.gov that has, very easy to use tools for households and individuals as well as businesses. But starting somewhere is really important. And so, consistent with our mission to help people before, during, and after disaster, we try to ensure that we have an environment where we're thinking through, those potentially that haven't received a seat at the table, if you will. So underserved populations, those that are under-resourced and may not necessarily respond the same way to a disaster as someone that might have more resources, is definitely something to think through. If you're thinking about, how do I start, from a readiness standpoint, we're always looking at what we can always do a little bit better. If a company has gone through COVID and they're looking at their strengths, their weaknesses, their opportunities, and their threats, just like I think a business would do.
Yeah.
That's going to give them an indication as to where they really need to start.
Love that advice. Well, what work is FEMA doing right now or in the near future to innovate the field of emergency management?
Emergency managers are problem solvers, and sometimes giving not enough resources and more mission than you can really handle. And FEMA certainly has an extraordinary track record when it comes to making a difference in the lives of people in our country. When faced with the challenge of setting up mass vaccination sites at the start of this year, we were called on. If you would have told us at the start of the pandemic that we would be responsible for that, I'm not sure that we would have said, yes, of course we will. But we rise to the challenge. And I think we find an internal resolve and an internal capacity to exceed expectations. And everybody at FEMA is really focused on that. We're not perfect. We are human, but we really do try to do all we can do to meet the mission requirements and then exceed them as much as we possibly can. The administrator has really set the tone for us at FEMA to learn, to adapt, and then also to innovate, right? Climate instability, climate change is something that we have to tackle. How do we adapt to that? How do we work with industry on that? How do we reduce our risk? That's an area where we're looking at, innovating. We're looking at some ways where, we can be just a little bit better. So that's a readiness aspect. And then I shared a few minutes ago about, the seat at the table, those that are potentially under-resourced, the communities or underserved populations. We can innovate in the way that we look at the world too. And so, there's a lot of risk in the world. There's a lot of risk in the communities that we serve. We're really trying to develop a strategy that meets some of these, I think, real drivers of instability, climate being the very macro thing, equity at the community level, and then readiness. We've got to be ready to meet the challenge of serving people in the communities that may not all look the same. And we've definitely got to, be able to be ready for not just the climate, but also, seismic threats, cyber threats. It's a dynamic threat environment out there, and we're an all hazards agency. And there's a number of different ways for us to, I think, rise to the challenge. One last thing I would just share about innovation is that, we do take cues from the private sector in what we think about, what we do. This is the second strategic plan where we have engaged the private sector, robustly to get some different thinking. So we don't want to necessarily be, insular And then also the FEMA administrator has the National Advisory Council that serves as a sounding board for the administrator as well, to really make sure that we don't have our blinders on, making sure that we are addressing, potentially an unforeseen threat or an unforeseen risk that just not able to see every day.
Yeah, I like how you take that community approach. Let's just get input from everywhere, because you never know where you'll find a great idea. We like to close out each episode by asking our guests to provide the listeners with a practical tip that they can take back to their organizations to improve their overall crisis response or emergency preparedness plans. So, in your opinion, what is one thing that our audience should keep in mind or be aware of as they modify or update their existing plans?
Flooding continues to be the number one threat. And making sure that you've got flood insurance as an individual, or flood insurance from a corporate entity, that really can help accelerate your recovery after disaster. If you go to FEMA.gov, you'll not only get information about flood mitigation assistance, the flood insurance program, but you'll also see other templates on readiness, on preparedness as well. The other thing too is maybe this is something that not a lot of people know about, and that is you can actually subscribe to the daily operations brief. Every morning we gather the interagency together, look at what the threats are, unclassified, and we have a daily operations brief. And so I know that many companies actually subscribe to the daily operations brief. You can subscribe to it on FEMA.gov. And then lastly, for the companies that would want to join the National BEOC, you can get some information on FEMA.gov as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate your time, expertise, and advice.
Well, thanks a lot for having me, Peter. And if fortunate enough to ever come back, I look forward to doing so. Appreciate the conversation.
Absolutely. This has been great. I've learned a ton. And if anyone out there listening wants to connect with you or just learn more about working with FEMA, what is the best way to do so?
So really the best thing to do is for my office, which is the Office of Business, Industry, and Infrastructure Integration, ob3i@fema.dhs.gov. That's the best way for us to be helpful to you. And then just for general reference, FEMA website is www.fema.gov. We're also active on Twitter and Facebook. So for your social media, using social media, following our accounts will get you also updates on different programs, as well as just staying abreast of how we're helping people before, during, and after disaster.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again for taking time to join us on the Employee Safety Podcast. For the rest of you out there, remember, nothing ever goes 100% according to plan in an emergency, so communication is incredibly important. If you can't communicate, you can't recover. Until next time.
Alert Media is changing the way your leaders and response teams connect and communicate effectively when seconds matter. We provide our customers with a comprehensive solution for monitoring threats around the world and deploying fast, effective emergency communication. You need a panic-proof solution for high-stakes moments. In just a few clicks, your team can send a multi-channel notification to an impacted group of people and confirm their safety immediately. When employee safety is at stake, don't just communicate. Connect and confirm with a robust emergency communication solution. Visit alertmedia.com for more information. You've been listening to the Employee Safety Podcast. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, we'd love for you to give a quick rating of the show. Just tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.